Hi, everyone. Welcome to Science Today, Monday, April 20th. For today, I just want to remind you to please take a moment and read the important announcements page that I posted today. Just a few bits of information that, since this is now our long-term deal, I've been fine-tuning a few things. So just go ahead and glance over that before the end of the day today. What we're talking about today is ecological succession, and we're going to compare the two types of ecological succession, primary versus secondary. The only thing I need you to turn in for today is the homework assignment in this folder on limiting factors and carrying capacity. You're going to want to go ahead and use your notes from Thursday that we took on those topics to help you complete that homework assignment. Okay, let's get started with today's topic, ecological succession, change really over time in an ecosystem. So if we're talking, actually let's get our notes first. Let's go ahead and title this entry Ecological Succession. And our focus questions today are, what are the basic stages of ecological succession? And what is the difference between primary and secondary succession? Now, if we're talking about succession, whether it's primary or secondary, they're both going to follow the same general process. And the process is really natural gradual changes in the types of species that live in an area. Another way you could think of that is basically how an ecosystem evolves over time. This is something that happens in any ecosystem, in any biome. And it's something, I'm sure your grandparents would tell you if they lived in the same house for a long time, how the yard looks very different than it did perhaps when they just moved in. The trees were much younger. So really over time, it's natural for an ecosystem to change. Now, succession, even though it seems kind of counterintuitive, it actually occurs in predictable stages, where each stage kind of is represented by certain species of plants and animals. And the reason for that is what's going to determine the plants and animals that live in an ecosystem at any given point in time are the biotic and abiotic factors that are present then. Now, as those factors change, that ecosystem then is going to become more ideal for different species, and thus we have that changing of the different types of communities that we have over long periods of time. Now, there are two types of succession, primary and secondary, are very familiar. The only main differences, and we'll talk about this more in depth, is that primary succession starts at stage 1, we call. Secondary succession, stage 1 has already taken place, so it kind of starts at stage 2 and carries out. But from stage 2 on, they follow the same process. Okay, so let's go ahead and define ecological succession. It's the gradual process by which the structure of an ecosystem evolves over time, and it follows these predictable stages. I always found that to be interesting because we know any ecosystem has different amounts of biodiversity, different biotic and abiotic factors, and despite this, they all kind of follow the same trend over time. One thing I do want to emphasize, though, is ecological succession, primary or secondary, you will never be able to observe this in your lifetime. Even the fastest ecological succession takes over one human lifetime to complete from start to finish. Okay, so let's talk about primary ecological succession. Primary succession starts in an ecosystem that is basically brand new. It's lacking soil. There's no soil to start. It's just exposed bedrock or exposed lava has just cooled over a long period of time. So something kind of like this, where we just have rock, and that's about it. Now, primary succession is slower than secondary succession for the exact reason that we just mentioned. It lacks soil. You don't realize how important soil is until you don't have it anymore. Remember, the basis of our energy pyramid, the basis of our food chain are producers, and producers, almost all of them, need soil to take root in, to get water from, to get nutrients from. So without soil, this is going to be a difficult process or a long process. So in primary succession, we have no soil. The types of areas this would occur in is, again, an area with freshly cooled lava, an area that's perhaps covered by landslides, so it's just covered by new dirt, or when a glacier melts, we call that glacial retreat. So these are some examples of areas where primary succession would occur. Something like that. The Hawaiian Islands are another good example of primary succession because remember, they formed from shield volcanoes that erupted and the lava cooled and they were just exposed rock as well. Now, the way life starts is quite interesting. It starts with the arrival of lichen, typically, which is one of the very few producers that does not need soil to survive. It can grow on just straight up rock. Here are a picture of some lichen growing on different rocks. I guarantee you've seen lichen. It looks very similar to moss. Okay, moss is closely related. So, however, you might not know how important it is. The first organisms that begin thriving in any new environment we call a pioneer species. Hopefully that name makes sense when you're thinking about the pioneers in social studies class. So here is our little lichen. Here is his little coonskin pioneer cap. And of course we have to have a lichen pun because why not? So lichen growing on the rock, I'm really liking you. Lichen are going to start the process of soil formation, which is so essential to get any sort of real biodiversity started. So the lichens will secrete chemicals, okay, along with weathering and erosion. Those three things are going to help break down our rock into smaller pieces and thus begin the soil formation. When the lichens themselves die, okay, they're going to add that organic material to the broken down rock, and that's going to start to form a very thin layer of soil. This process, very slow. It can take hundreds of years if everything's ideal. It can take thousands of years if it's less than ideal. Now, I just want to take a moment to talk about lichen in general because, again, this is one of those organisms that doesn't get enough recognition, okay? Because it really is so important and so unique. There are many different types of lichen, and a lot of people don't realize lichen itself is not one organism. It's actually composed of typically two different organisms in a mutualistic, right? So they're both benefiting relationship. And those two organisms are algae and fungus. If we wanted to look at a diagram of how they're kind of living together, you can see the algae are the green cells and they have chlorophyll. So they're able to undergo photosynthesis and they are able to generate the food. So the fungi actually provide the structure, and that's these kind of hairy looking threads. So they're going to provide the structure and the support. They're also going to be able to anchor toward alongside a rock. And so the algae provides the energy, the fungus provides the support and structure. And that's a really, really well-functioning mutualism, in action. If we're looking here, if you want a more kind of realistic picture, this is, I thought, a really good image of how, the algae is kind of being hugged in place by all the little fungus hyphae. Okay, lichen on rocks, just because, again, I want you to be able to recognize lichen if you see it. It comes in many colors, comes in many textures. Here's some on trees. I don't know about you, but this one up here, I see this all the time in trees in Pennsylvania. I've got this in trees in my yard. So this is a pretty common lichen, I think, in our biome. I've seen ones like this as well, not quite as common, only kind of in the deep woods if I'm hiking with my family. Okay, so let's add pioneer species. That we said lichen is an example of one pioneer species. It's the first species to colonize a new or barren or previously disturbed ecosystem. Many different species can be pioneer species, okay? In secondary succession, it doesn't have to be lichen because there's already soil, but the one thing they have in common is they're always going to be producers. Remember, it makes sense. Producers are the base of our food chain. And then let's just have a definition for lichen. Lichen, again, is made of algae and fungus and a mutualistic relationship, and they're going to be our pioneer species in primary succession. Because again, they're one of the few organisms that can live with no soil. Mosses can live with very little soil, but they need just a little bit. Okay, so now that we have the lichen, dying and forming our soil, we're going to get simple plants like mosses and ferns that are now able to grow after that thin soil layer is built up a bit. Then those plants die, and they add even more organic material to the soil. Okay, then the soil layer is going to get thick. Then grasses are going to move in. And each time a new species move in, like the grass is moving in here, that's going to kind of outcompete our mosses and our ferns and things like that. At this point, we're going to have some flowering plants, and we're going to start to have primary consumers, or aka herbivores, that are going to come in. As the grasses and the other plants die, we're going to add even more nutrients to the soil. And as the soil deepens, organisms like shrubs and trees that have deeper roots are going to be able to take hold. And with them comes more habitats, and larger animals like secondary consumers are now going to be able to survive. At the very kind of end of this process, we reach what we call a climax community. A climax community is the final stage of succession. The ecosystem will remain relatively unchanged until something else comes along and disturbs it. So just to summarize primary succession, we start with bare rock. Lichens move in first to start, forming that soil, followed by mosses. Then we're going to have herbs, weeds. We're going to start to see flowers and pollinators and primary consumers, grasses, shrubs. We typically will see pine trees, softwood trees, so coniferous trees first before seeing a lot of hardwood, deciduous, meaning leafy trees. And here would be our climax community.